I need you to understand something before I tell you this story. I was there. I was standing maybe 40 feet away when it happened, close enough to see his face, close enough to hear the sound the wrath made when they hit the ground, close enough to feel the air pressure change when the pen was uncapped. I know how that sounds. I know what you're thinking, a pen. A standard-issue Academy writing instrument. The kind they hand out in orientation packs along with a lanyard and a pamphlet about cafeteria hours. Yeah, that pen. And I need you to believe me, because the official record is going to be sanitized. The Galactic Defense Council is going to scrub the details, classify the footage, and issue a vague statement about a containment breach during routine training exercises. They're going to call what Cadet Marcus Hale did an improvised defensive maneuver. They're going to give him a medal in a quiet ceremony and tell him not to talk to journalists. But I was there, and I'm going to tell you what actually happened, in the order it actually happened, because the galaxy deserves to know what one 19-year-old human kid from Dayton, Ohio, did on a Tuesday morning in November. It started like every other morning at the Galactic Defense Academy. The Academy sits on Outpost Veridian 9, which is a long-term installation on the outer ring of the Orion Arm frontier. If you've never been to the frontier, imagine taking everything you know about remote and then tripling it. The nearest inhabited planet is a 4-hour transit jump away. The nearest human settlement is 11 hours out, and that settlement is a mining colony that smells like sulfur and loneliness. Veridian 9 itself is not a naturally habitable moon. It was terraformed about 60 years ago by a joint consortium human effort, which means the atmosphere is breathable but thin, the gravity is roughly 0.8 standard, and the sky is this strange amber-green color that never quite looks right no matter how long you've been here. First-year cadets always get a little disoriented when they step outside for the first time. The sky looks wrong, too wide, too bright at the edges. Like someone hung a painting instead of actual air. The Academy complex is built into the eastern ridge of the Veridian Plateau, a sprawling installation of maybe 300 buildings, training fields, simulation bays, weapons ranges, dormitory towers, and at the center of it all, the Grand Concourse. The concourse is where the 6 species of the Galactic Defense Consortium all share common space: dining, recreation, administrative processing, the big ceremonial hall where graduation happens. It's the symbolic heart of the place. Every species walks through it. Every cadet eats there, studies there, has arguments and breakthroughs and occasional fistfights there. I'd been at the Academy for 8 months by that November. I was a second-year human cadet, specializing in xenodiplomacy with a secondary in tactical analysis. My name is Cadet First Class Priya Nair, and at the time, I thought I was the most stressed person in the building because I had a defense simulation exam the following Friday. I want to say that again, I was stressed about an exam. That morning, the morning everything changed, I was in the third-floor library annex of Building 7, which is the Human Selrani Integration Facility. I was sitting across from Cadet Marcus Hale, who was my study partner and in the loosest possible academic definition, my friend. Marcus was from Dayton, Ohio. He was one of those people you meet and immediately think, this person is going to either change the world or completely destroy something. There was no middle ground with him. He was medium height, lean in that wiry way people get when their nervous energy made physical, with dark hair that never quite cooperated with Academy regulations. He had perpetual ink stains on his right hand because he wrote everything by hand, which was unusual. Most cadets used data pads for everything. Marcus used a notebook. An actual physical notebook with actual physical pages, and he filled them with the densest, most illegible handwriting I have ever tried to read. He said typing made him forget things. He said his brain worked differently with a pen in his hand. He had pens everywhere, in his pocket, in his bag, tucked behind his ear. The Academy Supply Issue 1's standard polymer barrel, pressurized chromatic ink chamber, designed to write in variable gravity environments. They were boring, functional objects. Nobody ever thought about them. That morning, Marcus had 2 of them on the table in front of him. He was working through a xenolinguistics problem, something to do with Vrath signal pattern encoding, and he kept picking up the pen and flipping it between his fingers while he read. Not nervously, just habitually, the way some people tap their foot or click their tongue. I asked him to stop. He didn't stop. He never stopped. "Hale," I said, If you flip that pen one more time, I'm going to throw it out the window. He looked up at me. We're on the 3rd floor. I know. He considered this. Then he set the pen down and went back to his notes, and for about 4 minutes, things were normal. Then the proximity alerts went off. The Academy has a 3-tier alert system. Tier 1 is yellow, a caution level. Equipment failure, atmospheric anomaly, wildlife incursion from the plateau. It happens a few times a semester. Everyone stays calm, goes to designated shelter points, waits for clearance. Tier 2 is orange, an emergency level. This means something serious. Medical crisis, breach of a secure facility, classified personnel incident. It's happened twice in Academy history that I know of. Tier 3 is red. Tier 3 means active hostile engagement. Tier 3 had never been declared on Veridian 9, not once in the 63 years since the Academy was founded. When the alert tone changed, when it dropped from the standard proximity ping to that lower, bone-vibrating frequency that I had only ever heard in simulation, I didn't understand what I was hearing. My brain refused to process it correctly. I remember thinking there must be an error, a test, a calibration problem with the alert system. Then the lights changed. The normal soft spectrum lighting in the library annex shifted to emergency amber, and the overhead speakers crackled, and I heard the voice of Commander Yeseth, a Selrani officer, one of the Academy's senior tactical staff, speaking in the rapid, clipped tones of someone who is frightened, but professionally committed to not sounding frightened. All cadets, this is a Tier 3 declaration. This is not a drill. All cadets are to proceed immediately to designated interior shelter positions. Repeat, this is a Tier 3 declaration. All training and administrative personnel to combat-ready positions. This is not. The transmission cut out. Not faded, not ended, cut, like something had interrupted the signal at its source. Marcus and I looked at each other across the table. Tier 3, he said. Yeah, that's never happened. I know. He picked up his pen. He didn't do it consciously. I could tell from his expression that he didn't even know he'd done it. His hand just found it and held it, and he sat there with this very still, very focused look on his face, listening. I realized I was hearing something low and rhythmic coming from outside the building. A sound like nothing I had a reference for, not an engine, not an explosion, not anything mechanical. More like a frequency, like something very large vibrating the air itself. I went to the window, and that's when I saw them for the first time. The Vrath. If you've seen the official briefing files on Vrath biology, you know the basics. They're apex predators from the Krashen system, classified as Category 7 threat organisms by the Consortium Intelligence Directorate, and they've been on the Consortium's restricted contact list for about 30 years. There were diplomatic incidents in the early settlement period, territorial disputes, deaths on both sides. Eventually, the Consortium drew a boundary, established no-entry zones around Krashen space, and declared the matter diplomatically paused, which is the Consortium's polite way of saying, we have no idea how to deal with these things, and we're hoping the problem goes away. The official briefing files describe the Vrath as bilaterally symmetrical hexapods with pronounced cranial sensory arrays and adaptive exoskeletal plating. They are careful words, very scientific, very detached. What they actually look like is a nightmare. Picture something roughly 8 feet tall when walking upright, which they don't always do. Sometimes they go horizontal, legs spreading out to the sides, body close to the ground, moving like a thing that used to be upright but hasn't forgotten what it feels like to hunt. Their exoskeletal plating is layered like overlapping tiles, dark and iridescent, not reflective exactly, more like the surface drinks light and refracts it wrong. Their heads are elongated, with a pronounced crest along the top that serves as their primary sensory array. They read electromagnetic fields the way we read air pressure, and their range is significant. They have 4 primary limbs and 2 shorter secondary limbs close to the body that appear vestigial, but aren't. The secondary limbs terminate in these precision appendages that are extraordinarily dexterous. Their primary limbs end in something that looks like a hand, if you're being generous, and a weapon if you're being accurate. They communicate in subsonic frequencies layered over a visual signal system, color changes in the plating at the neck and crest. Their language is one of the most complex signal structures ever cataloged by consortium xenolinguists, and I knew this academically because I'd spent 2 semesters studying it. I knew the signal patterns. I knew the color shifts. I had never thought I would see any of it outside of a classroom. When I looked out the 3rd-floor window of the library annex, there were 6 Vrath crossing the training field below. 6 of them. Moving in a formation that I recognized from the tactical files. A hunting spread. A pattern designed to cover maximum ground while maintaining line-of-sight contact with each other. They were not hurrying. They were not panicked. They were moving with the methodical, deliberate confidence of animals that have never had a reason to run from anything. I stepped back from the window. "Vrath," I said. Marcus was already behind me. He'd seen them too. His face was very still and his pen was in his hand, and he said very quietly, "How many?" 6 training field, moving toward the concourse. How? I don't know. We both knew how impossible this was. Veridian 9 has the most sophisticated perimeter defense network in the frontier sector. Automated sentinel arrays, quantum-encrypted barrier protocols, 3 layers of proximity scanning that extend 400 kilometers beyond the installation boundary. Nothing comes in without being scanned, tagged, and either cleared or destroyed. The Vrath shouldn't have been able to get within a planet's distance without triggering 14 different alert systems. And yet here they were. That question, how, was going to occupy a lot of people for a long time afterward. The answer, when it eventually came out, was both simpler and more terrifying than anyone expected. The Vrath had been studying the Academy's perimeter systems for 2 years. They'd found a specific electromagnetic blind spot in the scanning arrays, a gap that existed at the intersection of 2 sensor fields, a gap that corresponded exactly to their own M frequency signature. They had tuned themselves, essentially, adjusted the resonance of their sensory crests to match the frequency of the gap. To the perimeter system, they looked like background radiation. They'd been watching, they'd been learning, they'd been waiting. But none of us knew that yet. All we knew, standing in that amber-lit library annex on the 3rd floor of Building 7, was that 6 Vrath apex predators were walking across the training field and heading for the center of the Academy complex, and the comm channels had just gone silent, and every instinct I had was screaming at me to get down, get low, get away from the windows. "Shelter point," I said. "We need to get to the sublevel shelter." "The concourse," Marcus said. I turned and looked at him. "What?" He was still watching the window, that still, focused expression. "The concourse, that's where they're going." "I know that, which is why we're going to the shelter." "How many cadets have early classes in the concourse on Tuesdays?" He said it like he was doing math out loud. "Morning orientation sessions, first-year language seminars, the mediation workshop series. How many cadets do the consortium species share that space with?" I knew the answer because I'd been in those sessions myself, 1 year ago. On any given Tuesday morning, the concourse hosted somewhere between 80 and 140 cadets and faculty from all 6 species. The Selrani morning meditation gathering alone was 40 people. The first-year human orientation group was another 30. The concourse was a soft target. Large, open, full of unarmed students and teachers, no defensive hardpoints, no secure blast doors, a glass and composite structure designed to feel welcoming and light. I understood what Marcus was thinking, and I hated it. "Marcus, we are second-year cadets. We don't have combat ratings. We're xenodiplomacy track. We don't have weapons, we don't have authority to engage, and we don't have a plan." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he picked up his bag, put his notebook inside, pocketed his pens, and stood up. "I have a plan," he said. "That's not reassuring. That's extremely not reassuring." "Come on." Part 2, what MARCUS knew. Here's the thing about Marcus Hale that I should have understood sooner. He was not a conventional student. He was not in the academy for conventional reasons. Most cadets, most human cadets anyway, came to the Galactic Defense Academy because it was the fastest route to a career in consortium-aligned services. Government positions, diplomatic corps, defense contracting. You got the academy credential, you got access to a universe of opportunities that no Earth-based qualification could match. It was a practical decision for practical people. Marcus was here because he was obsessed. Not with military service, not with career advancement. He was obsessed with the Wrath. He'd been obsessed since he was 11 years old, when his older brother, a xenobiologist on a consortium survey vessel, had sent him a data file containing the first comprehensive acoustic study of Wrath communication patterns. Marcus had spent 3 years teaching himself to read the patterns before anyone told him what he was doing was considered one of the most technically difficult challenges in galactic linguistics. He'd gotten to the academy on a xenolinguistics scholarship specifically because of his Wrath studies. His thesis research, which he'd started as a first year, which almost nobody did, was titled Intentionality and Metacognition in Wrath Signal Communication, Evidence for Higher-Order Social Reasoning. He didn't study the Wrath because he was frightened of them. He studied them because he thought they were more than anyone gave them credit for. I knew this about him. I'd read his research. I'd had 100 conversations about Wrath signal structure and hunting behavior and territorial psychology. I knew his theory that the 30-year diplomatic pause with the Wrath wasn't a dead end, that it was the result of both sides failing to understand how the other was actually communicating. The consortium had sent diplomatic teams. The Wrath had responded with what appeared to be aggression. The consortium had concluded that the Wrath were incapable of meaningful diplomacy. Marcus thought the consortium had misread every single signal. I'd found it a compelling academic argument. I found it considerably less reassuring now that we were running down the stairwell of Building 7, with 6 Wrath crossing the courtyard outside. "Talk to me," I said. "What's the plan?" "Tell me what you saw when they were moving," he said without slowing down. "The crest coloration. Tell me exactly what you saw." I thought back. I'd been focused on the fact of them, not the detail. Fear does that. It collapses your perception to the most essential information, which in this case was large predatory aliens. Get away from them. But I'd spent 2 semesters studying Wrath signal structures, and some of that training had stuck even in the panic. The crest was dark, deep violet along the base, fading to gray at the tips. The neck plating was contracted. Were the secondary limbs extended or tucked? I tucked, definitely tucked, close to the body. Marcus made a sound that might have been satisfaction. "Good, that's good." "Explain why that's good." Deep violet crest with gray tips is a hunting arousal state. But contracted neck plating is a suppression signal. It means they're deliberately controlling the arousal state. And secondary limbs tucked means they're in an awareness-focused mode, not an attack-immediate mode. And in plain language, they're not here to kill everyone. He pushed open the stairwell door to the ground level. They're here for something specific. They're hunting something specific. What? He stopped. We were in the main corridor of Building 7's ground floor, and through the windows on our left I could see the edge of the grand concourse structure, 60 yards away. I could hear something now, a low subsonic vibration that I felt in my sternum more than heard with my ears. The Wrath were close. Marcus turned and looked at me with that expression. That one I'd come to recognize over 8 months of studying across from him, the one that meant he'd worked something out that he wasn't sure how to say. "Me," he said. I stared at him. "I published a paper," he said, "last month, on the Consortium Academic Research Network. My thesis interim report, the one Professor Chen forced me to submit even though I told her it wasn't ready. It's the most comprehensive English language analysis of Wrath metacognitive signal structures ever published. It demonstrated something specific. Which is that the Wrath understand exactly what they're saying to us. They've always understood. The failed diplomacy 30 years ago wasn't a failure of communication on their end. They made a specific offer, a territorial challenge offer, which in Wrath social structure is actually an invitation to negotiate boundaries. The consortium read it as an attack posture and responded with a withdrawal. I processed this, and the Wrath would have read that as submission without acknowledgement, which in their social structure means the challenging party is owed a response, a formal response, and if no response comes, he paused. You don't ignore a territory challenge from a Wrath hunting pack. You respond, or you abdicate, or you engage. Those are the 3 options. The consortium did none of them. They withdrew and declared a diplomatic pause, which is not a concept that exists in Wrath social structure. So from their perspective, They issued a formal challenge 30 years ago and have been waiting for a response ever since. And when my paper was published, analyzing their communication for the first time in accurate detail, from their perspective, someone finally heard them, I said. Heard them, he agreed. I thought about that for a moment. 6 Vrath apex predators, biological killing machines capable of dismantling a combat shuttle with their primary limbs, crossing a military installation to find a 19-year-old xenolinguistics cadet from Dayton, Ohio. Because he'd read their letters. Okay, I said. So what's the plan? He reached into his pocket and took out a pen. He held it up, standard Academy supply issue, polymer barrel, pressurized chromatic ink chamber, boring and functional. I'm going to talk to them, he said. Part 3, the concourse. I want to describe the grand concourse, so you understand what we walked into. The concourse is the building that sits at the geographic center of the Academy complex. It's roughly circular, about 200 meters in diameter, with a translucent composite dome that lets in the amber-green light of Viridian's sky. The interior is tiered. The main level is a broad, open floor with hexagonal tables and seating adapted for all 6 consortium species, since different species have different postural needs and the furniture accommodates that. Above the main level are 3 tiers of gallery space where various group activities happen, seminars, language workshops, the meditation spaces that some species use in the mornings. It's designed to feel communal, open, safe. When we pushed through the exterior doors of the concourse, the first thing I heard was silence. Not the absence of sound, the presence of held breath. The particular quality of silence that a room full of people makes when they are trying very hard not to make any sound. The concourse was full. Somewhere north of 100 cadets and faculty, all species represented, in various states of frozen terror. I could see Selrani cadets, tall, willowy, 6-limbed, pressed against the far gallery walls. Human first-years huddled under the hexagonal tables, which wouldn't stop anything but gave them the psychological comfort of cover. The Dorvaki representative, a massive quadruped from a high-gravity world, was standing completely still near the main entrance, which was the most alarming thing of all because Dorvaki never stood still. And in the center of the concourse floor, in the open space between the table clusters, were the Vrath. All 6 of them. They were not attacking. This was the first thing I registered, and it hit me like cold water. They were not attacking. They were standing in a loose cluster in the center of the room, and every person in the room had given them roughly a 40-foot radius of clear space, and the Vrath were doing something I had never seen in any tactical file or training simulation. They were waiting. Their crests were up, fully extended, which is a significant posture in Vrath body language. The coloration had shifted from the deep violet I'd seen through the window. Now the crest showed a banded pattern, alternating bands of bright teal and dark amber running down the length of the crest from base to tip. The neck plating was not contracted. It was open, spread outward slightly, which I'd learned in my second semester as an acute awareness display. They were looking for something. They were looking for someone. Marcus stopped just inside the main entrance of the concourse. He stood there for a moment, looking at the Vrath, and the Vrath, all 6 of them simultaneously, as though they shared a single sensory apparatus, turned toward him. The subsonic vibration changed frequency. I felt it in my back teeth. One of the Vrath stepped forward. The largest one, the crest, was most pronounced, the plating most deeply colored. I assumed this was the pack leader, but later Marcus told me the Vrath don't have a single leader structure. They have a primary signal initiator, which is not quite the same thing. This Vrath stepped forward until it was at the edge of the open space, maybe 30 feet from where we were standing, and it made a sound. Low, resonant, multi-layered, not one frequency but several, stacked, with a rhythmic modulation that made the air feel textured. And simultaneously, its neck plating shifted color in a rapid, complex pattern, a cascade of signals running from dark amber to pale gold to a deep blue-green and back, with a specific flicker sequence at the ends of the crest. I couldn't read it fast enough. My training was academic, not conversational. I caught fragments, a territorial marker, something that felt like an interrogative, what I thought was a proximity acknowledgement signal that I'd only ever seen in the theoretical papers. Marcus could read it. I knew he could because I watched his face. I watched his expression go from focus to absorbing to something else. Something I can only describe as recognition. The look of someone hearing their name for the first time after a long silence. He reached into his pocket and took out the pen. The thing about Vrath communication is that it's both sonic and visual, and neither component alone is sufficient. You need both to convey full meaning. The sonic layer carries the primary semantic content, the what. The visual layer, the crest and plating coloration, carries the contextual and intentional layer. The who and the why and the how I mean this. Human speech is almost entirely sonic. We have some visual communication, gesture, expression, posture, but it's supplementary. For us, language lives in sound. Marcus couldn't produce Vrath subsonic vocalizations. Human vocal apparatus is not built for it. The frequency range is wrong, and the multi-layer stacking is a biological function of the Vrath resonance chambers in their thorax. There's no human analog. What Marcus had figured out, and this was the thing that his thesis paper was actually about, the thing that made it significant, was that the visual layer of Vrath communication was complete in itself. Redundant, not supplementary. The color patterns carried the full semantic content of what was being communicated, not just the contextual modifier. The sonic layer emphasized and reinforced. The visual layer was the message. And the Vrath could read color signals from any source, not just their own kind. Their sensory arrays read electromagnetic signatures across a broad spectrum. They saw color with a precision and range that made human color vision look like seeing through dirty glass. What Marcus had also figured out, and this was the part I didn't learn until afterward, the part he hadn't published yet, was that the chromatic ink in Academy supply issue pens had a spectral range that overlapped significantly with the frequencies the Vrath used in their plating communication. The ink was designed to write in variable gravity, which meant it contained a pressurized carrier medium that kept the pigment in a uniform colloidal suspension. The pigment particles were fine enough to produce a spectral signature when applied to a reflective surface. When you uncapped an Academy pen and drew with it, you were producing a controlled chromatic signal. Marcus had been experimenting with this for months, alone in his room, drawing Vrath signal patterns in Academy pen ink on the white composite panels beside his desk, checking his color charts, adjusting the pressure to control the spectral signature. He'd been teaching himself to speak. When Marcus uncapped the pen, I heard the sound of it over the subsonic vibration, over the held-breath silence of 100 terrified people, and I think it was the most significant sound I've ever heard in my life. A tiny click. The mechanical sound of a polymer cap releasing a pressurized ink chamber. The Vrath heard it too. Or rather, the Vrath sensed it. The electromagnetic shift when the pressurized ink made contact with the atmosphere. The chromatic ink, pressurized and now exposed, produced a faint spectral bloom that I couldn't see with my eyes, but the Vrath sensory arrays read instantly. The lead Vrath, the signal initiator, went absolutely still. All 6 of them went absolutely still. Marcus turned and looked at me. "I need a surface," he said very quietly, "something flat and light-colored." I looked around. I was not in that moment thinking clearly. I was operating in a kind of emergency autopilot where my brain was doing things without consulting me. I moved to the nearest hexagonal table where 3 first-year human cadets were huddled underneath, and I grabbed the tabletop presentation board that someone had left on top. White composite, about the size of a large notebook. I handed it to Marcus. He took it. He looked at the lead Vrath. He began to draw. I want to describe what followed as methodically as I can, because the details matter and memory is imperfect, and I want to get this right. Marcus held the board in his left hand and drew with his right. He drew quickly but not carelessly, with the precision I'd seen him use in his notebooks when he was working through something that required exact attention. He was drawing from memory, I realized. He'd memorized the signal patterns so thoroughly that his hand knew them without him having to think about where the lines went. The first pattern he drew was, he told me later, an acknowledgement signal. A basic formal acknowledgement that says, "I received your transmission. I am a valid signal source. I am responding." In Vrath communication, this pattern is the first thing you say in any formal exchange. It establishes that both parties are in contact and acknowledges that a signal has been received. Without this, anything else you say is contextually floating, unanchored, potentially meaningless. The Vrath have been trying to send this signal to the consortium for 30 years, and the consortium has never sent it back. They've sent responses, but not this response. Not this specific pattern that says, "I heard you." Specifically you, I'm talking to you. When Marcus held up that first pattern, the lead Vrath changed color. Not slowly, instantly. A full-body shift that ran from the crest tip down through the neck plating, a cascade of pale gold that I'd never seen before in any of the training files. I didn't know what it meant in that moment. I found out later. It meant relief. Not a human interpretation of relief, not sentiment, not emotion as we understand it, but the functional equivalent, a signal that says, the waiting has ended. The waiting that has been waiting has now ended. 30 years of waiting. Marcus saw it. I could tell from his face. He understood what he was looking at, and for just a moment his expression was something I'd never seen from him before. He looked stricken, not frightened, moved, the way you look when you realize the scale of something you're standing in the middle of. He drew the second pattern. The second pattern was longer. He filled about a third of the board, working in careful strokes. I couldn't read what he was drawing. I knew the signal library, but not at this speed, not in this context, not when each stroke was carrying the kind of semantic weight he was packing in. Later, he told me what he wrote. He wrote, "We recognize the territory challenge of 30 cycles past. We acknowledge the invitation to negotiate. We acknowledge the silence that followed as a failure of understanding, not intent. We are present. We are ready to respond." 30 cycles, 30 years. And he did it, he told me, because it was what needed to be said. Not because he was authorized to say it, he absolutely was not. Not because the consortium wanted him to say it, they hadn't even known this conversation needed to happen. But because it was the honest, accurate thing. Because the Vrath had been waiting 30 years for an acknowledgement that was owed to them, and Marcus was the first person who could give it to them, and the people in the room with him. 100 cadets from 6 species, all of them unarmed, all of them terrified, all of them completely helpless in the face of apex predators that could dismember a combat shuttle, needed him to say the thing that would make those predators understand that the silence had been a mistake, not a declaration. The lead Vrath read the pattern. Then it did something I've never seen in any recording, any tactical file, any xenobiological study of the species. It turned and addressed the other 5. The visual signal it sent them ran across its full body, crest, neck plating, even the larger dorsal plates that are usually stable, and it was fast and complex, and I could only catch fragments of it. But one element I recognized because Marcus had spent a full week drilling it into me during our study sessions. Intent peaceful. Intent exchange. Intent acknowledgement. One of the other 5 Vrath, smaller, with a crest that was less pronounced, turned toward Marcus and produced its own pattern. A sequence I didn't know. A question, it looked like, from the way the colors built and held and ended on that specific open-edge configuration that Marcus had described as Vrath interrogative. Marcus looked at it, he thought for a moment, then he drew his response. He told me later he'd been asked, who speaks for the many. He'd answered, a student, not yet authorized, but present. The Vrath's response to that was another color I'd never seen. Marcus translated it for me afterward, with a small, slightly bewildered expression on his face. Then the student carries weight above station, it had said. This is noted. This is acceptable. Part 4, the crisis inside the crisis. While Marcus was having this conversation, the rest of us were managing our own separate catastrophe. By the time Marcus drew his first pattern, the Academy's combat response teams had mobilized. They were positioned outside the concourse. I found this out later from Commander Yeseth, about 40 personnel in full tactical gear, armed with pulse weapons capable of lethally engaging Category 7 threats. They had taken their positions within approximately 4 minutes of the Tier 3 declaration, which is actually very good response time, and they were waiting outside the concourse for authorization to breach. The authorization problem was this. The Vrath were inside a building full of cadets, in close proximity to unarmed non-combatants from 6 different species. Engaging with pulse weapons in an enclosed compositan glass structure would create shrapnel, pressure waves, and secondary injury risks that the tactical assessment calculated would result in between 30 and 60% non-Vrath casualties before the engagement could be resolved. 60% of 120 cadets. The Academy Commandant, Rear Admiral Thesek, a Dorvaki military officer of considerable experience, had the authorization panel in her hands, and she was not pressing it. She was looking at the tactical casualty assessment, and she was not pressing it, because 60% of 120 cadets was 72 people, and Thesek had spent 40 years commanding military installations, and she was very good at her job, and she understood that 72 cadets was a price she could not pay if there was any alternative. She didn't know about Marcus yet. Nobody outside the concourse did. The internal communication systems had been disrupted by the Vrath's M signature, an automatic effect of having 6 Category 7 organisms in a small enclosed space. Their sensory arrays passively radiated electromagnetic noise at a frequency that interfered with standard military comms. The observers outside the concourse could see, through the translucent dome, that something was happening, that the Vrath were not attacking, that the cadets appeared to be alive, that there was some kind of interaction taking place, but they didn't know what. Commandant Thesek held the authorization panel. She watched through the dome. She did not press it. Later, in the formal inquiry, she said that she made the decision to hold because the Vrath's behavioral posture was non-aggressive, and the cadets were alive, and something was clearly happening that she didn't understand. She said she held because a good commander holds when they don't understand the situation well enough to act without making it worse. She held for 11 minutes. 11 minutes is a very long time to hold. Inside the concourse, I was watching Marcus and watching the Vrath, and doing the one thing I was capable of doing, which was absolutely nothing. I had positioned myself about 15 feet behind Marcus, far enough to be non-intrusive, close enough to be useful if I could figure out anything useful to do. Around me, the other cadets remained still. Some of the first years were crying quietly. Some of the Selrani were doing something with their limbs that I recognized as a meditative calming practice. One of the Dorvaki cadets had apparently fallen asleep standing up, which is something Dorvaki can do under extreme stress as a biological response, and which looked deeply alarming given the context. The exchange between Marcus and the Vrath continued. Draw weight response, draw weight. It was slow, the way all real communication is slow, the way any conversation between parties who are working through translation and history and misunderstanding, and 30 years of accumulated silence is slow. There were moments when Marcus paused for a long time before responding, his pen held still, his expression working through something. Moments when the Vrath's response was complex enough that I could see him processing it, the slight movement of his lips as he ran through the signal library in his head. The board filled up. He turned it over and used the back. At some point, I think it was around the 8-minute mark, one of the other Vrath moved, not toward Marcus. It moved to the side, away from the main group, and it crouched down near one of the hexagonal tables. Slowly. Deliberately. And it looked under the table at the 3 first-year human cadets who had been hiding there for the better part of 10 minutes. I felt my stomach drop. The Vrath looked at them for a long moment. Then it made a very soft subsonic sound, barely above the threshold of sensation, and its crest shifted to a specific pattern of pale blue with white edges. I knew that pattern. I'd studied it in my second semester material. It was a non-threat declaration, an explicit signal used within Vrath social groups to communicate I am not a danger to you in this moment. It's what an adult Vrath does when it encounters a young Vrath that's frightened. It was telling them it wasn't going to hurt them. One of the 3 cadets, a girl with red hair, first year, I didn't know her name then, slowly uncurled herself from under the table. She sat up on her heels and looked at the Vrath from about 4 feet away. She was shaking visibly, and she looked at the pale blue crest pattern, and something in her registered, maybe the training, maybe just that some signals are universal enough to cross species barriers, and she stopped shaking quite as hard. The Vrath held the blue pattern for a long moment. Then it withdrew slowly and returned to the group. I think about that sometimes. I think about it a lot. At the 11-minute mark, Marcus lowered the board. I had been watching him closely enough that I could see the moment he decided something, some internal resolution. He capped the pen, put it in his pocket, and took a single step forward toward the lead Vrath, the signal initiator, and he stood there and he made a gesture. It wasn't a Vrath gesture. It wasn't from the signal library. It was completely human. He raised both hands, palms out, and held them there. He told me later he wasn't sure why he did it. He'd done everything through the pen up to that point, all the formal communication, all the structured exchange. And then he'd reached a natural pause in the conversation, and he'd wanted to indicate something, and the most natural thing he knew how to do was hold out his empty hands. The lead Vrath looked at him. Its crest was very still. A single sustained color, pale gold, the same gold it had shown when it first registered the acknowledgement signal. The waiting has ended. Then it raised two of its primary limbs. Not in a threatening posture, not with the characteristic forward lean of a Vrath attack configuration that I'd studied in tactical training. It raised them in a way that was different, elevated, away from the body, the appendages open. Marcus recognized it immediately. His breath caught audibly, even from 15 feet away. He translated it for me that evening. He'd never seen it outside of one reference in an academic paper about Vrath greeting ceremonies from an anthropological study done by a xeno-researcher named Dr. Ine Vessel, who had never gotten close enough to a live Vrath to verify if it was accurate. It was accurate. It meant we came, we were heard, we will remember this. It meant the encounter was over. Part 5, how it ended. I want to be precise about the next few minutes because the precision matters. The Vrath did not leave immediately. They don't operate on human social time frames. An encounter like this, formally concluded, requires a formal exit sequence. Over the next 6 or 7 minutes, the lead Vrath and Marcus exchanged a few more patterns. Marcus later described these as procedural closings, the equivalent of scheduling a follow-up meeting, establishing that formal diplomatic channels would be sought. Marcus wrote, and the Vrath responded, and at some point he turned and looked at me and said, very quietly, "Can you get someone on the comm? Someone with diplomatic authority. I think I need a witness for this next part." I tried my personal comm. It was dead Vrath M interference. I tried the table communication panels, also dead. I looked around the room, and I remembered that Professor Chen, my xenodiplomacy professor, who ran the morning Selrani language seminar, had been in the concourse when this started. I found her against the gallery wall on the second tier. She was a small, silver-haired woman who had been in xenodiplomacy for 30 years, and she was watching the proceedings below with an expression of absolute professional amazement. I went up the stairs and found her and said, very quietly, "Marcus needs a witness." She looked at me for 1 second. Then she straightened her jacket and walked down the stairs and stood beside Marcus. The lead Vrath looked at her. Its crest pattern shifted slightly, an addition, a modifier, a query. Marcus drew something brief on the board. Later, he told me he'd written, "This is a senior member of our exchange organization. She can carry the record of this meeting." The Vrath's response was a cascade of colors that ran down its full length, crest to dorsal plate to the secondary limbs, and Marcus went very still watching it, and when it finished, he put the pen in his pocket and stood there for a moment with his eyes closed. "What did they say?" Professor Chen asked. Marcus opened his eyes. "They said the student has the record weight of the many behind them, and this is sufficient." He paused. "They said the formal exchange will be honored. They're requesting a consortium diplomatic response within 1 year through established channels." Another pause. They said they came today because the paper was heard. Because someone used their language accurately without error, and they needed to know if the source was an authorized speaker or..." He stopped. "Or," Professor Chen said. "Or if they would need to wait again," Marcus said. The silence in the room was different now. Not the held-breath terror of the first minutes, something else, something weightier. The lead Vrath made one more sound, a single, sustained frequency, lower than the others, that I felt in my bones and in the soles of my feet and in the back of my throat. It held for about 4 seconds. Then it stopped. And the Vrath turned, all 6 of them, and walked toward the exit. The cadets scrambled to clear the path, not with panic, with something more careful than panic. A kind of instinctive respect for the space the Vrath needed to move through. The Vrath walked through the concourse and out the main entrance, and I heard a commotion from outside, the tactical team encountering them, the rapid escalation of voices, someone shouting, stand down," and then a long silence, and then the sound of the Vrath's movement fading across the training field. And then they were gone. What happened immediately after is both very clear and very confused in my memory, which is how it always is after something like this. Commander Yesith came through the doors with a tactical team and spent about 90 seconds looking at a room full of alive, unharmed cadets and trying to understand what she was seeing. Then she saw Marcus and Professor Chen standing in the middle of the open floor with a pen and a filled presentation board, and she stood there for a long moment, and then she said, in a tone of voice I will never forget, "Someone explain this to me, right now." Professor Chen did the explaining. She did it calmly and comprehensively, which I appreciated because I wasn't sure I could have spoken in complete sentences at that point. The first-year cadets who had been under the table came out slowly. The red-haired girl, I learned later her name was Cadet Annalise Brandt, sat on the floor for a while with her back against the table and her arms around her knees, not crying, just sitting. Some of the Selrani medic staff came in and began working through the room. The Dorvaki cadet who had been stress sleeping woke up and immediately asked what he'd missed, with a directness that made several people laugh in the way people laugh when the alternative is something less productive. Marcus sat down on the floor in the middle of the concourse. He sat there with his back straight and his arms on his knees and the pen in his right hand, turning it slowly between his fingers, and he looked like someone who had run a very long distance and had only just realized they'd stopped. I sat down next to him. We didn't say anything for a while. Then he looked at the pen. He looked at it like he was seeing it for the first time, which I understood in some sense he was. It had been a writing instrument 20 minutes ago. It was something different now. "Your plan," I said eventually. "Yeah. Your plan was to draw at them." He turned the pen between his fingers. "Technically, I was writing. You wrote at 6 alien apex predators. I wrote to them. I thought about this. Was that in the plan the whole time, since we left the library?" He was quiet for a moment. "Since last semester," he said. "Since I figured out the ink spectrum overlapped with their visual range. I'd thought about it, if I ever had the chance to test the hypothesis." "That was a hypothesis test. A very applied one." I stared at him. "Marcus, you could have led with that. You would have stopped me." He wasn't wrong. I sat next to him on the floor of the Grand Concourse while the Academy's tactical team secured the perimeter, and the medical staff moved through the room, and the amber-green light of Viridian's sky came in through the dome overhead. I sat there and I thought about 30 years of silence, and one paper published before it was ready, and a pen uncapped at the right moment by the right person. "They were waiting 30 years for someone to answer," I said. "Yeah. And you were the one who answered." He looked at me. "Someone had to." Part 6, Aftermath, what happened next? The formal inquiry took 6 weeks. Marcus testified 3 times, once to the Academy's internal board, once to the Consortium Intelligence Directorate, and once to a closed session of the Diplomatic Relations Committee that he's never been allowed to describe in detail. Professor Chen testified twice. I testified once and spent most of it answering questions about signal pattern interpretation that I was only partially qualified to answer. The outcome of the inquiry was officially classified. The public statement from the Galactic Defense Council described a containment breach during an advanced training exercise and credited the disciplined response of Academy personnel for the safe resolution. Marcus Hale was mentioned once, in a subordinate clause, as a cadet participant. He got a commendation medal 6 weeks later in a ceremony attended by 12 people. I was one of them. Commander Yesith and Professor Chen were 2 others. The rest were various consortium officials whose titles I was never told. The medal is a standard consortium commendation, a flat composite disc in the colors of the 6-species flag, with a citation on the back that says, "For distinguished service during a critical diplomatic event." It's about the size of a drink coaster and weighs almost nothing. Marcus keeps it in his desk drawer under a stack of notebooks. He went back to his thesis research. He finished it 8 months later. The final paper, titled "A Framework for Formal Diplomatic Exchange with Vrath Social Groups. Signal Structure, Historical Misinterpretation, and a Pathway to Resumption of Negotiations," was submitted to the Consortium Diplomatic Academic Archive, where it sat in a classified queue for 4 months before being released with heavy redactions. The unredacted version, which I've seen because Marcus trusts me and also because I helped him edit it, is extraordinary. 11 months of work, 347 pages, a complete signal dictionary for Vrath formal communication, and a step-by-step framework for the diplomatic process that the consortium had failed to initiate 30 years ago. The consortium followed the framework. 6 months after Marcus graduated from the academy, with honors obviously, the first formal diplomatic exchange with the Vrath took place. It was conducted by a team of 6 xenolinguists, 3 of whom had been trained using methods Marcus had developed. The negotiations took 2 years. They resulted in the Treaty of Veridian, which established formal territorial boundaries, mutual access zones, and an ongoing exchange program. There's a plaque in the Grand Concourse now. It commemorates the event. It says the right things in the right diplomatic language and credits the Treaty of Veridian to the collective effort of the Consortium Diplomatic Directorate. It doesn't mention Marcus. It doesn't mention the pen. Part 7, what I want you to know. I've thought a lot about what the story of that morning actually is. What the real story is, underneath the classified inquiry and the sanitized public statement, and the plaque that doesn't tell the truth. I've thought about it because Marcus is too busy to tell it himself, and wouldn't be especially interested in telling it even if he had the time. He doesn't think of himself as the protagonist. He thinks of himself as someone who happened to be in the right place with the right information at the right moment, and he'd be the first to point out that without 2 semesters of signal pattern study, during which I tested him mercilessly on the vocabulary, his response to the Vrath signal might have contained errors. He is generous like that. It's both genuine and slightly maddening. But here's what I keep coming back to. The Vrath came to the academy that day. They bypassed the most sophisticated perimeter defense system in the frontier sector, using a vulnerability they'd identified over 2 years of patient observation. They walked into a building full of unarmed students and staff. They had the biological capacity to cause catastrophic harm, and there was essentially nothing in the room that could have stopped them. And what they wanted, what they had wanted for 30 years, was to be heard. Not destroyed, not defeated, not driven back into their boundary zones by weaponry they'd long since learned to avoid. They wanted someone to say, "I received your transmission, I'm here, I'm talking to you." And the only person who could say it was a 19-year-old cadet with ink stains on his hand and a pen in his pocket, who had spent 2 semesters teaching himself a language that nobody thought would ever be useful in a real situation. The galaxy, the broader, enormous, complicated, multi-species galaxy, is full of signals that haven't been received yet, full of transmissions sent into silence by species or people or groups who are waiting for an acknowledgement that never comes. The consortium has 6 member species and maybe 40 political entities, and 100 unresolved diplomatic situations. And most of them are unresolved not because the problems are impossible, but because the people in the room don't have the language for them yet. Marcus had the language. He'd built it himself over 2 years from academic papers and ink experiments, and a signal vocabulary memorized so thoroughly that his hand knew where to go without his brain having to intervene. He had it because he'd paid attention to something everyone else had dismissed. He had it because when his brother sent him a data file when he was 11 years old, he didn't put it in a folder and forget about it. He read it. He kept reading it. He asked what it meant, and when nobody could tell him, he figured it out himself. The Vrath heard his paper, a published paper on an academic network that Vrath intelligence assets monitored. They heard it because it was accurate, because for the first time in 30 years, someone had described their language correctly, had understood what they were saying, had treated their communication as meaningful rather than threatening. They came to find the source of the signal because that's what you do when someone finally gets it right. And Marcus met them, not with weapons, not with an evacuation protocol, with a pen and a practiced hand and 3 years of quiet, obsessive preparation. Part 8, the last part. Annalise Brandt, the red-haired first year who came out from under the table and looked at the Vrath, transferred into the xenolinguistics track at the start of the following semester. She's 2 years ahead of her original field now. She's doing her thesis on Vrath juvenile communication patterns. She told me once that she changed track because of what she saw that morning, not the fear of it, but the moment with the Vrath and the pale blue crest. She said, "It looked at me, and it told me it wasn't going to hurt me with color, just with color, and I wanted to understand that. I wanted to understand anything that could do that." She understands it now. She's very good. Marcus graduated. He's working for the newly formed Vrath Diplomatic Exchange Office, which is a small, underfunded, somewhat chaotic operation run out of a converted storage facility in the Capital District on Consortium Prime. He still uses paper notebooks. He still has ink stains on his hand. He's working on the second stage of the formal communication framework, which involves establishing a two-way channel, teaching Consortium diplomatic staff to produce Vrath visual signals, and teaching Vrath signal initiators to decode human acoustic speech. It's slow work, it's complicated and delicate, and there are setbacks and misunderstandings and moments when the whole thing feels like it might collapse. The Treaty of Veridian is a beginning, not an ending. 30 years of silence doesn't get resolved in 2 years of negotiations. But it got started, on a Tuesday morning in November, in a room full of frightened cadets and amber-green light and the subsonic vibration of something very large making itself understood. It got started because a kid from Dayton, Ohio, read the right paper at 11 years old and never stopped asking what it meant. And because he had a pen in his pocket. I think about the moment he uncapped it sometimes, the sound of it, that small, ordinary click in the middle of all that held-breath silence. Everyone in the room heard it. Some of them later described it as the moment they understood something was different, that what was happening was not an attack but an encounter, that there was a distinction and the distinction mattered. The Vrath sensed it immediately, the electromagnetic signature of the ink making contact with air, the spectral bloom that their sensory arrays read as an incoming signal. They had come expecting to find a speaker, a source of the signal they'd read in the paper, someone capable of formal exchange. And when the pen was uncapped, they got their confirmation. Signal source identified, present and responding. The waiting has ended. I asked Marcus once what it felt like when he drew that first pattern, when he held the board up and saw the lead Vrath shift to pale gold, when he understood that it had worked. He was quiet for a while. He was turning the pen between his fingers, which is his default state of being. "There's this thing that happens," he said, "when you've been working on something for a long time, in isolation, without being sure it's right or whether it matters or whether you're wasting your time. And then the moment comes when you find out." He paused. "It felt like that," he said, "like finding out it mattered." The concourse has been renovated since then. The dome was reinforced, and the internal communication systems were upgraded with M-resistant hardware. The hexagonal tables are new, different design, more stable, which is apparently a lesson someone drew from the experience of several dozen terrified cadets sheltering under them. The plaque is on the east wall. 40 cadets walk past it every day without reading it. In Marcus's apartment on Consortium Prime, on the wall beside his desk, there's a piece of white composite board. Both sides are covered in chromatic ink, faded a little now, 8 months after it was drawn, but still legible if you know the language. If you know what to look for. He kept it, of course he kept it. It's the conversation, the one that ended the silence. There's a detail that didn't make it into any official record. I know it because I was there. After the Vrath left, after the tactical team came in and Commander Yeseth got her explanation, and the room slowly returned to something like functioning. After all of that, when Marcus was still sitting on the floor in the middle of the concourse, one of the first-year cadets came over to him. A Selrani boy, tall and blue-limbed, who looked about as shaken as anyone in the room. He sat down on the floor across from Marcus, and he looked at the presentation board and he said, in careful, accented English, "What did you say to them?" Marcus looked at him. "I told them someone was listening," he said. The Selrani cadet thought about this. Then he said, "Was that true?" Marcus looked down at the pen in his hand. He thought about it, genuinely considered the question, which is a Marcus Hale thing to do. He doesn't give answers he hasn't earned. "Yes," he said finally, "it was true." The Selrani cadet nodded slowly. Then he said something in Selrani, a phrase I knew from my coursework. A formal acknowledgement, the kind you use when someone has done something that deserves to be named. Then he got up and walked away. Marcus turned the pen between his fingers one more time. Then he put it back in his pocket. He always had another one. This account was composed from memory, personal notes, and testimony given during the formal inquiry process. I am Cadet First Class Priya Nair, second-year Xenodiplomacy track, Galactic Defense Academy, Outpost Veridian 9. Everything in this account is true. Everything in the official record is incomplete. The Vrath didn't come to destroy us. They came to be heard. That distinction is the only reason any of us are alive to read this.